Sometimes the smallest hands carry the biggest dreams. When 8-year-old Sani lost her grandmother, she inherited more than memories. She inherited a promise to bring her scattered Apache family home. With nothing but her grandmother's turquoise bracelet, a crumpled $100 bill, and her faithful pony Kola, Sani bought an entire ghost town called Esperanza. The old landbroker thought it was the strangest sale of his life. The abandoned buildings hadn't seen life in decades, just dust and desert wind. But Esperanza wasn't empty. Behind the boarded windows and broken doors, a family had been hiding for years. An elderly couple and their grown son, carrying secrets that tied them to this forgotten place. When Sani began cleaning the old buildings, she discovered she wasn't alone. What secret had kept this mysterious family hidden in the ghost town for so long? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the San Carlos Apache reservation as Sani Thunderhorse sat on her grandmother's porch, turning the turquoise bracelet over in her small hands. 3 months had passed since grandmother Ayana's funeral, but the ache in her chest felt as fresh as the desert morning air. The bracelet caught the light, its silver bands worn smooth by generations of Apache women. Each turquoise stone told a story. Some her grandmother had shared during their long evenings together, others lost to time like so many family memories. Sani's fingers traced the familiar patterns, remembering how grandmother's weathered hands had guided hers, teaching her the old ways of beadwork and storytelling. "The family is scattered like seeds in the wind," Grandmother Ayana had said during her final weeks, her voice barely a whisper. "Someday, little one, you must gather them home. Find a place where the Thunderhorse family can be whole again." Those words echoed in Sani's mind as she watched her pony Kola graze in the small corral. Behind the house, the buckskin mare was her closest companion now, a gift from grandmother for her 8th birthday just 6 months ago. Kola seemed to understand Sani's moods better than most people, offering gentle nuzzles when tears came and patient ears when stories needed telling. The screen door creaked as Aunt Maria emerged with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Sani, though it was mostly milk and sugar, what grandmother had called practice coffee for growing girls who wanted to feel grown up. "You're thinking about her again," Aunt Maria said, settling into the old wooden chair beside her niece. Sani nodded, taking a careful sip of the warm, sweet liquid. "She used to tell me stories about our family, about Uncle Robert, who became a teacher in Phoenix, and Cousin Sarah, who married that rancher in Colorado, Great-Uncle Thomas, who moved to Montana for railroad work. She worried about them," Aunt Maria admitted. "About all of us living so far apart. In the old days, families stayed together. The children learned from the elders, and the elders were cared for by the young. That's what she wanted me to do. Bring everyone home." Sani's voice was small, but determined. "She said I'd know how when the time came." Aunt Maria smiled sadly. "Your grandmother saw things differently than most people. She believed in dreams and signs that the rest of us might miss." After breakfast, Sani walked Kola out to their favorite spot, a small rise overlooking the valley where grandmother had taught her to read the landscape. The old woman had possessed an almost mystical ability to understand the desert, predicting weather changes by the way clouds gathered and finding water in places that seemed impossibly dry. As Sani brushed Kola's coat, she pulled out her grandmother's journal from her saddlebag. The leather-bound book contained decades of stories, recipes, and observations, written in grandmother's careful handwriting. Many entries were in Apache, which Sani was still learning to read, but others were in English, meant for the grandchildren, who might struggle with the old language. One entry from 2 years ago caught her attention. "Dreamed again of Esperanza, the place where hope lives. Old railroad town in the desert, empty now but waiting. The spirits there are restless, seeking peace. Perhaps this is where our scattered family could heal." Sani had read this entry dozens of times, but today something clicked differently. Esperanza, she'd heard that name before. During one of their evening conversations, Grandmother had mentioned a ghost town she'd visited as a young woman, a place that had once been full of life, but was abandoned when the railroad changed routes. "Could that be it, girl?" Sani asked Kola, who flicked her ears attentively. "Could that be where we're supposed to gather the family?" The idea seemed impossible. How could an 8-year-old girl buy a whole town? But Grandmother had left her a small inheritance, exactly $100, and the turquoise bracelet. "For your future," the will had said. "Use it when the path becomes clear." That afternoon, Sani convinced Aunt Maria to drive her into town. The reservation's small main street held a handful of businesses, including Murphy's Real Estate, dusty office that handled property deals for the surrounding area. Old Pete Murphy had been selling land in these parts for 40 years, and Grandmother had always said he was honest, if a bit eccentric. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. Pete looked up from his desk, his weathered face breaking into a smile at the sight of Sani. He'd known her grandmother well, often stopping by to share stories about the changing landscape and the families who'd come and gone over the decades. "Well, if it isn't little Sani," he said, rising from his chair with the careful movement of a man whose joints had seen too many desert winters. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" "I'm okay, Mr. Murphy. I wanted to ask you about something." "Grandmother mentioned a place called Esperanza?" Pete's eyebrows rose. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in a while. Ghost town about 60 miles northeast of here. Been empty for, 25 years now. Used to be a railroad stop, had a general store, a few houses, even a small school. But when the railroad rerouted through Tucson, the town just dried up." "Who owns it now?" Sani asked, her heart beating faster. "Officially, the state, I suppose, though there's been talk of selling it for years. Nobody much wants a bunch of old buildings sitting in the middle of nowhere." Pete studied her with curious eyes. "Why do you ask?" Sani took a deep breath and pulled out her grandmother's journal, turning to the page about Esperanza. She explained. About the inheritance, about Grandmother's dream of gathering the family, about her feeling that this ghost town might be the answer. Pete listened with the patience of a man who'd heard stranger requests over the years. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandmother was a wise woman," he finally said. "If she thought Esperanza was important, there's probably something to it." He pulled out a thick folder from a filing cabinet. "As it happens, I do have the paperwork for that property. Been trying to find a buyer for years, but nobody wants to take on a whole town, even a dead one." "How much?" Sani asked, though her voice was barely a whisper. Pete flipped through the papers, adjusting his reading glasses. "Well now, let me see. State wants to get rid of it, clear it off the books, with all the buildings in such poor condition, structural issues, no utilities." He paused, looking at Sani over his glasses. "I suppose they might take $100 just to have it gone." Aunt Maria gasped. "Pete, you can't be serious." "Dead serious," Pete replied. "Sometimes the state just wants to clear old properties. And if this little one has her grandmother's vision about it, well, maybe she's the right person to bring it back to life." Sani's hands shook as she pulled out the crumpled $100 bill. "I have this, and grandmother's bracelet." Pete's expression softened. "Keep the bracelet, child. That's family history you'll want to hold on to. The money will be enough." He began pulling out forms. "Though I have to ask, what are you planning to do with a ghost town?" "Fix it up," Sani said simply. "Make it ready for when the family comes." "Oh, man." The paperwork took an hour. Pete walked them through every document, explaining what each one meant. By the end, Sani Thunderhorse, age 8, was the legal owner of the ghost town of Esperanza, Arizona. As they drove home, Aunt Maria kept shaking her head. "I can't believe we just did that. Your parents are going to think I've lost my mind." But Sani felt a strange peace settle over her, as if some invisible weight had lifted from her shoulders. For the first time since Grandmother's death, she felt truly hopeful. Tomorrow, she would ride Kola out to see her new town. That evening, As desert stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sani sat on the porch again with grandmother's journal. Near the back, she found an entry she'd never noticed before. "The child will understand when the time comes. The spirits of Esperanza have been waiting for someone with the right heart to find them. Not all ghosts are from the past. Some are futures waiting to be born." Sani smiled, touching the turquoise bracelet on her wrist. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something important. She could feel it in the desert wind that whispered through the sagebrush, carrying promises and possibilities across the vast Arizona landscape. The morning of Sani's first visit to Esperanza dawned clear and bright, with the kind of desert clarity that made distant mountains look close enough to touch. She had packed carefully, water for herself and Kola, some jerky and crackers, and, most importantly, her grandmother's journal and a small Apache blessing bundle that Aunt Maria had given her for protection. The ride took 3 hours across terrain that grew increasingly desolate. They followed old dirt roads and animal trails, with Kola picking her way carefully over rocky ground and around barrel cacti. Sani had studied the hand-drawn map Pete Murphy had given her, but the desert had a way of making landmarks shift and change. Just when she began to worry they were lost, they crested a small hill, and there it was. Esperanza spread before them like a collection of children's toys abandoned in a sandbox. The buildings were weathered grey wood and sun-baked adobe, their windows either boarded up or gaping dark. A main street ran through the center of town, flanked by what had once been a general store, a saloon, a small church, and perhaps a dozen houses of varying sizes. At the far end sat a larger building that might have been a hotel or boarding house. Kola snorted softly and pranced sideways, her ears swiveling nervously. The mare was usually calm and steady, but something about the ghost town was making her anxious. "Easy, girl," Sani murmured, patting Kola's neck. "It's just old buildings, nothing to worry about." But as they rode down what had been the main street, Sani felt an odd sensation herself. Not quite fear, but a heightened awareness, as if invisible eyes were watching their approach. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind, and through broken shutters and the soft clop of Kola's hooves on packed earth. They stopped in front of the general store, which seemed like the logical place to begin. The building's false front still bore faded letters: Esperanza Mercantile, EST 1882. Sani dismounted and tied Kola to a hitching post that looked sturdy enough to hold, though she wasn't planning to go far from her horse. The store's front door hung askew on rusted hinges. Sani pushed it open carefully, wincing as it creaked loud enough to wake the dead. Inside, dusty shelves lined the walls, and an old wooden counter dominated one corner. Decades of wind had blown sand and debris through cracks in the walls, creating small dunes in the corners. But as Sani's eyes adjusted to the dim interior, she noticed something odd. While everything was covered in dust, some areas looked disturbed, as if someone had been walking through recently. A path through the dust led from the door to the counter and then toward a back room. She followed the path carefully, her heart beginning to beat faster. In the back room, which had probably been storage space, she found something that made her freeze. Footprints in the dust, fresh footprints, much too large to be hers. "Hello," she called out, her voice sounding small. In the empty space, "Is someone there?" Only silence answered, but Kola suddenly whinnied outside. Not in fear, but in the way she did when she sensed other people nearby. Sani hurried back outside, where she found Kola staring intently at the upper windows of the building across the street. For just a moment, Sani thought she saw a pale shape move away from one of the windows, but it happened so quickly she couldn't be sure. "Did you see someone, girl?" she asked Kola, who continued to stare at the building. Determined to solve the mystery, Sani walked Kola across the street to investigate. This building had been someone's home, a modest 2-story house with a front porch that ran the width of the building. As they approached, Sani noticed something that made her stop short. On the porch sat an old wooden rocking chair, and despite the fact that everything else in town was covered with dust, this chair looked recently used. The seat was worn smooth, and there was a clear space around it where the wind-blown sand had been disturbed. More telling still, when Sani approached and placed her hand on the chair's armrest, it was warm. Someone had been sitting here very recently. Someone who had fled when they heard her approaching. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," Sani called out, her voice carrying across the empty street. "I'm Sani Thunderhorse. I bought this town, but I don't want to make anyone leave. I just want to fix it up." No response came, but Kola's ears swiveled toward the house behind them, suggesting that someone was indeed listening. Sani sat down in the warm rocking chair, setting it into gentle motion. She opened her grandmother's journal to the page about Esperanza and began to read aloud. "Dreamed again of Esperanza, the place where hope lives. Old railroad town in the desert, empty now but waiting. The spirits there are restless, seeking peace." As she read, she became aware of small sounds, not quite footsteps, but the subtle creaks and settling noises that come from buildings when people move inside them. Someone was definitely there, probably more than one person, listening to her words. "My grandmother used to say that some places hold on to the people who loved them," Sani continued, closing the journal. "Maybe that's what happened here. Maybe. Some people loved this place too much to really leave." The sounds stopped, as if whoever was listening was holding their breath. Sani stood up from the rocking chair and pulled a small bundle from her saddlebag, some of the crackers and jerky she'd brought for the journey, along with a water bottle. "I'm going to leave some food and water here," she announced, "in case anyone gets hungry or thirsty. I'll come back tomorrow to see how the town is doing." She placed the offerings on a small table beside the rocking chair, then remounted Kola. As they rode back toward the main street, she heard something that made her heart skip, the soft sound of a door opening, followed by light footsteps on the porch. Someone had come out to collect the food. At the edge of town, Sani turned Kola around for one last look at Esperanza. In the upper window of the house where she'd left the food, she saw a definite shape, an elderly woman with grey hair, watching them leave. When their eyes met across the distance, the woman didn't hide. Instead, she raised one hand in what might have been a tentative wave. Sani waved back, then called out, "I'll see you tomorrow." The ride home seemed shorter, filled as it was with excitement and mystery. Aunt Maria was waiting on the porch when they arrived, anxiety written across her face. "Well, how was your ghost town?" Sani dismounted and began unsaddling Kola, taking her time to find the right words. "It's not as empty as people think," she finally said. "There are folks there who've been taking care of it. I think they've been waiting for someone to come back." "What kind of folks?" Aunt Maria asked, helping her carry the saddle into the barn. "The kind who love a place too much to leave it," Sani replied, echoing her grandmother's words. "I think grandmother knew they were there. I think that's why she wanted me to find Esperanza." That night, as Sani fell asleep, she thought about the woman in the window and the warm rocking chair. Tomorrow, she would return with more supplies and perhaps some answers. Something told her that the real story of Esperanza was just beginning to unfold, and she was meant to be part of it. Outside her window, the desert wind carried the faint scent of sage and the promise of mystery solved, and new friendships formed in the most unlikely of places. Sani returned to Esperanza the next morning with Kola loaded down like a pack mule. She had convinced Aunt Maria to let her bring extra supplies, canned goods, fresh bread, bottled water, and even some of her grandmother's herbal tea blends. More importantly, she carried a small toolkit that had belonged to her grandfather, thinking that if people were living in the old buildings, they might need help with repairs. The ride felt different this time. Where yesterday had been about discovery and mystery, today felt like visiting friends she hadn't met yet. Kola seemed to sense the change too, stepping more confidently along the desert trail and nickering softly as Esperanza came into view. The rocking chair on the porch was empty when they arrived, But Sani noticed immediately that the food and water she'd left the day before were gone. In their place sat a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Her heart racing with curiosity, she dismounted and approached the porch. Inside the cloth bundle was a beautiful hand-carved wooden horse, no bigger than her palm. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every muscle and mane hair carefully detailed, the wood polished smooth by countless hands. Wrapped around the horse's neck was a tiny piece of paper with words written in careful script. "Thank you for your kindness. A friend." Sani held the wooden horse up to the light, marveling at its beauty. This wasn't something quickly made. This was the work of someone with real skill and patience. She looked up at the windows of the house, hoping to see her mysterious friend. But the glass remained dark. "Hello?" she called out. "Thank you for the beautiful horse. I brought more supplies." She began unloading Kola's saddlebags, arranging the items neatly on the porch. As she worked, she talked steadily to the apparently empty air, the way her grandmother had taught her to do when visiting sacred places. "My grandmother used to carve too," she said, unwrapping a loaf of Aunt Maria's fresh bread. "She made little animals and birds. She said that when you carve something, you put a piece of your spirit into it. This horse feels like it has a good spirit." A soft sound from inside the house, maybe a footstep, maybe just the building settling, encouraged her to continue. I found some interesting things in her journal about Esperanza. She wrote that this place was special, that it was waiting for the right time to come alive again. I think she meant when people were ready to heal. Sani pulled out her grandmother's journal and opened it to a page she'd marked the night before. "Listen to this. The old places remember what we forget, that healing comes not from running away from pain, but from finding safe spaces to feel it." She wrote that after visiting here when she was young. This time, she definitely heard movement inside the house. Encouraged, she continued reading from the journal, sharing her grandmother's stories about the desert, about family, about the way pain and joy could exist in the same heart without destroying each other. As she read, she became aware that someone was listening from very close by, probably just inside the front door. The realization should have been frightening, but instead it felt natural, like sitting with a shy friend who needed time to trust. After an hour of reading and talking, Sani heard the door creak open just slightly. She didn't turn around, didn't want to spook whoever was there, but she smiled. "I'm going to explore the town a little," she announced, "see what needs fixing, but I'll be back to check on the supplies." She spent the afternoon investigating the other buildings. The old church still had most of its roof, though some pews were broken and the altar needed repair. The general store would need new floorboards in several places. Many of the houses had broken windows that could be boarded up temporarily and replaced eventually. But in one of the smaller houses, clearly a family home with a kitchen, sitting room, and 2 bedrooms, she made a discovery that stopped her. Cold. In what had obviously been a child's bedroom, she found toys scattered on the floor as if a little boy or girl had just been playing there. A wooden train set, some marbles, a few books with pictures of cowboys and horses, and in the corner, a child-sized bed with a quilt that, while faded, was clearly handmade with love. The room felt frozen in time, but not from abandonment, from grief. Someone had kept this room exactly as it was, preserving it like a shrine. The toys were dusty but arranged with care, and the bed was made with hospital corners that spoke of military precision. Sani touched the wooden horse in her pocket and understood. Whoever had carved it had once made toys for the child who lived in this room, and something had happened to that child, something that made a family unable to leave this place behind. She knelt beside the small bed and whispered a prayer. Her grandmother had taught her for children who had passed on too soon. As she prayed, she heard soft footsteps on the porch outside. When she finished and looked out the window, she saw an elderly man standing by Kola, gently stroking the mare's neck. He was tall and lean, with silver hair and the weathered hands of someone who'd worked outdoors his whole life. Kola, who was usually wary of strangers, stood perfectly still under his gentle touch. The man murmured something to her in what sounded like Spanish, and Kola actually lowered her head as if inviting more attention. Sani stepped outside carefully, not wanting to startle him. "She likes you," she said softly. The man looked up with eyes that were kind but deeply sad. "She is a good horse. Apache bred?" "Yes, sir. Her name is Kola. It means friend in Apache. A good name." He continued, stroking Kola's neck. "You are the little girl who bought our town. I'm Sani Thunderhorse, and I didn't mean to buy anyone's home. I just wanted a place where my family could gather." The man studied her for a long moment. "I am Miguel Santos. My wife Elena and we have been the caretakers here for many years. We heard you reading your grandmother's words. She was a wise woman. You knew her?" "Not personally, but I knew her reputation. The Apache healer who could see things others couldn't." Miguel smiled slightly. "Elena said if Ayana Thunderhorse's granddaughter bought this place, there must be a reason." Sani felt a wave of relief. "I don't want to make you leave. I just want to fix things up, make it nice for when my relatives visit. Perhaps," Miguel said slowly, "we can help each other. This place needs young hands and fresh hope, and you need people who know its secrets." From the house across the street came the sound of a door opening. A woman appeared on the porch, small and gray-haired, with Miguel's same kind but wary eyes. She said something in rapid Spanish, and Miguel nodded. "My wife says to tell you that dinner will be ready soon, if you would like to join us. We have much to talk about." As the sun began to set over Esperanza, painting the adobe walls in shades of gold and rose, Sani felt a deep contentment settle in her chest. She wasn't alone in her dream anymore. She had found the guardians of this special place, and they were willing to trust her with its stories. Elena Santos proved to be as gracious as she was cautious. Her kitchen in the old house was a marvel of organization and comfort, with herbs hanging from the rafters and copper pots that gleamed despite their age. She had prepared a simple but delicious meal of beans, rice, and fresh tortillas, along with a stew that smelled of cumin and chilies. As they ate by lamplight, the town had no electricity, but the Santos family had made do with oil lamps and candles. Elena studied Sani with sharp, intelligent eyes. Her English was heavily accented but clear, and she chose her words carefully. "Miguel tells me you found the child's room," she said, passing Sani another warm tortilla. Sani nodded. "It felt like someone still loves whoever lived there, Elena." And Miguel exchanged a look that spoke of years of shared pain. "Our grandson," Elena said quietly. "David. He lived in that room when he was small, when his parents worked in Phoenix and we cared for him during summers." "What happened to him?" Sani asked gently. "He grew up," Miguel said with a sad smile, "became a soldier, went to fight in wars far from home. When he came back," he gestured helplessly, "the war came back with him. He cannot find peace." Elena rose and disappeared into another room, returning with a faded photograph in an ornate frame. She handed it to Sani carefully, as if it were made of spun glass. The photograph showed a younger Elena and Miguel standing in front of the very house where they now sat. Between them stood a beautiful woman with long dark hair and a man in work clothes, and in front of the group was a boy of perhaps 6, grinning at the camera with gap-toothed joy. The boy had Miguel's kind eyes and Elena's stubborn chin. "This was taken 20 years ago," Elena explained. "David's parents both died in a car accident when he was 12. We raised him here in Esperanza until he turned 18 and joined the army. He came back 3 years ago," Miguel continued, "but not really. The boy who loved carving wood and helping with the gardens, he is gone. This man who came back, he is afraid of his own shadow. He cannot bear to be around people, but he cannot bear to be alone either." "Where is he now?" Sani asked. Elena pointed toward the window that faced the back of town. "He has a small place behind the old hotel. He comes and goes like a ghost. Sometimes we see him working on the buildings in the middle of the night, fixing things. He carved that horse you carry. I saw him working on it for days after we first spotted you coming to town." Sani touched the wooden horse in her pocket. "He made this for me. For you, for the memory of the child he used to be, for hope he doesn't dare to feel. Who can say?" Elena's voice carried a mother's grief. "He has not spoken more than a few words to us in months. But when Miguel told him about the little Apache girl who bought the town with her grandmother's bracelet, something changed in his eyes." After dinner, Miguel walked Sani around the town by lantern light, showing her the improvements that had been made over the years. The Santos family had indeed been caretakers, maintaining the structural integrity of the buildings, keeping the wells clean, and even cultivating a small garden behind their house. "Why did you stay?" Sani asked as they paused in front of the old church. "After the town died, why didn't you leave like everyone else?" Miguel was quiet for a long time, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "My grandfather worked for the railroad when Esperanza was built. My father was born here. When the railroad moved and people began to leave, we stayed because this was home. Later, when David needed a place to heal," he shrugged. "Sometimes staying is not a choice. Sometimes it is just what love looks like." "My grandmother wrote about this place," Sani said. "She thought it was waiting for something." "Perhaps it was waiting for you," Miguel replied. "Elena, she has dreams sometimes. Last week she dreamed of children playing in the streets again, of families gathering for celebrations. She woke up crying, but not from sadness, from joy." They walked back toward the house, where Elena was waiting on the porch with cups of tea brewed from desert herbs. As they sat in comfortable silence, Sani became aware of movement in the shadows at the edge of town. A tall figure moved between the buildings like smoke, pausing occasionally to adjust something or pick up debris. "That's him, isn't it?" she asked softly. "David," Elena nodded. "He cannot sleep in enclosed spaces since he came home. But he works on the town every night, as if he's trying to build something back that was broken. Could I meet him?" Miguel and Elena exchanged another look. "He is very frightened of people now," Elena said gently. "Especially children. I think they remind him of things he saw in the war, things that hurt his spirit. My grandmother used to say that some hurts can only be healed by what caused them," Sani said, surprising herself with the wisdom in her own voice. "Maybe he's afraid of children because children are what he needs to remember how to trust again." As if summoned by her words, the figure in the shadows stopped and turned toward them. For a moment, David Santos stood perfectly still in the moonlight. Tall, lean man, with his grandfather's build and his grandmother's watchful eyes. Even from a distance, Sani could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself ready to flee. Slowly, deliberately, Sani pulled the wooden horse from her pocket and held it up so the lamplight caught it. She didn't call out or wave, just held the small carving where David could see it, a silent message of gratitude and connection. For several heartbeats, grandfather and grandson looked at each other across the space that separated them. Then David raised one hand, not quite a wave, but an acknowledgement. He had seen her appreciation for his gift. A moment later, he melted back into the shadows, but something had changed in the air. Elena squeezed Sani's hand. "Tomorrow," the old woman said, "I will teach you to make the honey cakes David loved as a boy. Perhaps the smell will draw him closer to home." As Sani prepared to leave, she had promised Aunt Maria she would be home. By full dark, Elena disappeared into the house and returned with a bundle similar to the one that had held the wooden horse. "For your journey home," she said, "and for your return tomorrow." Inside the bundle, Sani found a small hand-drawn map showing shortcuts between the reservation and Esperanza, along with a note written in Elena's careful script. "For the granddaughter of the wise woman, welcome to our family." Riding home under a canopy of desert stars, with Kola's steady gait carrying her through the cooling night air, Sani felt as if her life had suddenly become much larger and more meaningful. She had set out to buy a place for family gatherings, and instead had found a family that needed gathering itself. The wooden horse in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, connecting her to a man she had barely glimpsed, but somehow understood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to build bridges over the gaps that war and loss had carved between human hearts. When Sani arrived at Esperanza the following morning, she brought more than just supplies. Hidden in her saddlebags was a small leather pouch that had belonged to her grandmother, an Apache medicine bundle containing herbs and healing items. Passed down through generations of Thunder Horse women, she had spent the evening before learning from Aunt Maria about the contents: willow bark for pain, sage for cleansing, sweetgrass for peace, and several other plants whose names she was still learning to pronounce in Apache. More importantly, she had listened to stories about how her grandmother had used these medicines not just to heal bodies, but to heal spirits wounded by loss and fear. Elena was waiting on the porch with evident excitement. Her weathered hands clasped together as she watched Sani and Kola approach. "I have been up since before dawn," she called out. "The honey cakes are ready, and I found something else David might remember." Inside the house, the kitchen was filled with the warm scent of baking and cinnamon. Eleanor led Sani to a wooden chest in the corner, carefully lifting out items wrapped in soft cloth, a child's wooden blocks with letters carved into them, a small leather glove worn smooth by young hands, and a faded picture book about horses. "These were David's when he was your age," Elena explained, her voice soft with memory. "Miguel carved the blocks, and David would spend hours building towers and houses. The book, he read it so many times we had to tape the spine back together." They arranged the honey cakes on a plate. Sani noticed Elena moving stiffly, her hands trembling slightly as she worked. When the older woman paused to rub her swollen knuckles, Sani recognized the signs her grandmother had taught her to watch. "Your hands hurt," Sani observed gently. Elena tried to smile. "Old age. The desert is hard on joints that have seen too many years." "My grandmother had medicine for that kind of pain," Sani said, pulling out the leather pouch. "She taught me some things before she passed. Would you let me try to help?" Elena's eyes widened as she recognized the medicine bundle. "Your grandmother was a curandera, a healer. I heard stories, but I never thought to meet someone who learned from her directly." Sani opened the pouch carefully, the way her grandmother had shown her. Inside, wrapped in small pieces of cloth, were dried herbs and roots that carried the wisdom of generations. She found what she was looking for, a mixture her grandmother called grandmother's relief, made from willow bark, wintergreen, and other plants that grew in the high desert. "This needs to be made into tea," Sani explained, "and some of it can be mixed with a little oil for rubbing on the joints." Elena watched with fascination as Sani prepared the medicine, her movements careful and deliberate. As the tea steeped, filling the kitchen with a sharp, clean scent, Elena shared stories about the pain that had grown worse over the years. "The work of keeping this town from falling apart is hard on an old body," she admitted. "Miguel and we repair what we can, but we are not as strong as we once were. And David, he works like a man possessed at night, but he will not let us help him during the day." When the tea was ready, Sani served it to Elena in a cup that had belonged to David as a child, a small ceramic mug painted with horses that galloped around the rim. Elena sipped it slowly, her expression changing as the warmth spread through her body. "This is remarkable," she said after a few minutes. "The aching is already less." They spent the morning working together on small repairs around the house, with Elena teaching Sani practical skills: how to patch adobe walls, how to oil hinges so they wouldn't squeak, how to identify which boards were sound and which needed replacing. In return, Sani shared more of her grandmother's healing knowledge and stories about life on the reservation. Around midday, Miguel returned from checking the water wells with news that made Elena's face light up. "The honey cakes worked," he announced. "David took 3 of them from the windowsill while I was away, and he left something. On the kitchen table they found a new carving, not a horse this time, but a small eagle with wings spread as if in flight. Beneath it was a note in David's Careful handwriting. Thank you for remembering. D. He is getting closer, Elena whispered, touching the wooden eagle with reverent fingers. This is the first time he has written anything to us in months. That afternoon, Miguel took Sani to see more of Esperanza's history. Behind the town, partially hidden by a grove of desert willows, stood the remains of the old railroad depot. The platform was crumbling, but the building itself was structurally sound, its red brick walls still strong after decades of abandonment. My grandfather helped build this, Miguel said, running his hand along the weathered brick. He came here from Mexico to work on the railroad, met my grandmother in this very town. They raised 5 children here before the railroad moved. Inside the depot, the ticket windows were boarded up, but the main waiting room still had its original wooden benches and a large slate board where train schedules had once been posted. Miguel had clearly been maintaining this building too. The floors were swept clean, and someone had repaired several broken windows. David spends time here, Miguel explained. I think the big open space feels safer to him than enclosed rooms. Sometimes I find evidence that he has been sleeping here instead of in his shelter. They climbed a narrow staircase to the depot's second floor, which had once housed the station master's office and living quarters. From the windows, they could see the entire town spread out below them, and beyond that, the vast expanse of desert that stretched to the horizon. From here, you can see anyone approaching from miles away, Miguel noted. I think that gives David some peace. As they stood looking out over Esperanza, Sani had a sudden vision of what the town could become. Not just a gathering place for her scattered relatives, but a healing place for anyone who needed time and space to put broken pieces back together. The depot could be a community center. The houses could shelter families in need of a fresh start, and the church could host celebrations and ceremonies that honored both Apache and Mexican traditions. Miguel, she said slowly, what if we made this a place where people could come to heal? Not just my family, but anyone who needed it. Miguel looked at her with surprise. You would share your town? My grandmother always said that healing works. Best when it's shared, Sani replied. Maybe that's what Esperanza has been waiting for, not just to come alive again, but to become something new. As they walked back toward the house, they noticed David working in broad daylight for the first time. He was repairing the roof of the old church, his movements efficient and sure. When he saw them approaching, he didn't disappear as he usually did. Instead, he paused in his work and gave them a small nod of acknowledgement. The honeycakes are working, Miguel murmured, and perhaps something else as well. That evening, as Sani prepared to ride home, Elena pressed a small package into her hands. More of David's carvings, she explained. He left them for you, but he is not ready to give them himself yet. Inside the package, Sani found 3 more wooden animals, a rabbit, a roadrunner, and a tiny owl. Each was carved with the same exquisite detail as the horse and eagle, but these seemed somehow lighter, less burdened with sadness. He is remembering how to create beauty instead of just fixing what is broken, Elena observed. That is a good sign. As Sani rode home through the cooling desert evening, she carried with her not just the wooden animals, but a growing sense of purpose. Esperanza was becoming more than she had dreamed, not just a gathering place, but a place of genuine healing. And at the center of it all was a broken soldier who was slowly learning to trust the world again, one small carving at a time. 2 weeks into their growing friendship, Miguel took Sani on what he called a journey into the heart of Esperanza's secret. They rode Kola together, Miguel behind Sani, his weathered hands gentle on the reins, to a place he had never shown anyone except Elena and David. About a mile from the town, hidden behind a cluster of red rock formations, Miguel led her to what appeared to be just another desert hillside. But as they approached, Sani could see that nature and human hands had worked together to create something extraordinary. This is why Esperanza was built here, Miguel said, dismounting and helping Sani down. Not just for the railroad, but because this land has always been sacred. He led her around the base of the largest rock formation to reveal the entrance to a shallow cave, its mouth partially concealed by centuries of wind-blown sand and growing vegetation. But what took Sani's breath away were the walls inside. The cave was covered in petroglyphs, ancient drawings that seemed to dance in the filtered light. Horses galloped across the stone surfaces, their manes flowing in eternal wind. Human figures raised their arms to the sun, and spirit animals leaped between worlds. Some of the images were clearly very old, their lines worn smooth by time, while others looked more recent. "Your people made these," Miguel said softly. "Apache artists, some from hundreds of years ago, others much more recent. This was a place where they came to pray, to seek visions, to connect with the ancestors." Sani reached out to touch one of the images, a young girl riding a horse with stars scattered around them like blessings. "How did you know about this?" "David found it when he was 12, Miguel explained. "After his parents died, he would come here to be alone with his grief. He added some drawings of his own. Here, see." Miguel pointed to a section of the wall where the petroglyphs had a different style. Mixed among the traditional Apache images were more modern scenes, trains carrying people away from their homes, families separated by distance and circumstance, and in the center, a small town waiting under an endless sky. David understood that this place was about more than just the past, Miguel continued. He saw that it was about connection between people, between generations, between the living and those who have passed on. As Sani studied the cave paintings, she began to understand why her grandmother had dreamed of Esperanza. This wasn't just a ghost town that needed restoration. It was a place where healing had been happening for centuries, where people had come to find peace and connection when the world became too painful to bear. "Is this why David came back here after the war?" she asked. Miguel nodded sadly. He hoped the peace of this place would heal what the war had broken in him. But healing is not something that happens quickly or alone. He has been trying to do it by himself for 3 years. They spent an hour in the cave, with Miguel sharing stories about the different images and their meanings. Some were hunting scenes, others showed ceremonies and celebrations, but many depicted the eternal themes that connected all people: love, loss, hope, and the search for belonging. When they emerged from the cave, they found David waiting by Kola. He stood perfectly still, like a deer ready to bolt, but he didn't run when he saw them. Instead, he looked directly at Sani for the first time since she had arrived in Esperanza. "You saw the paintings," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "They're beautiful," Sani replied simply. "Especially the ones you added." David's eyes widened. "In surprise? Grandfather told you I drew some of them?" He showed me the train carrying families away, and the town waiting for them to come home. It reminded me of my grandmother's stories about our scattered relatives. For a moment, David's carefully guarded expression softened. "I used to dream about bringing everyone back," he admitted. "When I was small, I thought if I could just make Esperanza perfect enough, all the people who left would return." "What changed?" Sani asked, gently. David's face closed again, but not as completely as before. "I learned that some things can't be fixed. Some people can't come home. My grandmother used to say that can't and not yet sound the same but mean very different things," Sani offered. Miguel watched this exchange with wonder. It was the longest conversation David had held with anyone in months. When David didn't respond immediately, Miguel suggested they return to town for lunch. As they rode back together, David walking alongside Kola, Sani noticed him glancing at her frequently, as if trying to solve a puzzle. When they reached the town, instead of disappearing as he usually did, he followed them to Elena's kitchen. Elena nearly dropped the pot she was holding when she saw her grandson standing in the doorway. But she recovered quickly, her face breaking into a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. "David," she said simply, "you are just in time for lunch." What followed was the first family meal the Santos family had shared in 3 years. David sat at the table stiffly at first, his eyes darting toward the door as if planning his escape. But gradually, as Elena served bowls of her wonderful stew and Sani shared stories about life on the reservation, his shoulders began to relax. "Tell me about your grandmother," David said suddenly, surprising everyone. "Grandfather says she was a healer." Sani described Ayana Thunderhorse, her wisdom, her gentle strength, her ability to see connections that others missed. She talked about the stories her grandmother told, the medicines she prepared, and most importantly, her belief that healing happened not through forgetting pain, but through learning to carry it with grace. She would have liked this place. Sani concluded, "She always said that the most powerful healing happened where people felt safe enough to remember who they really were." David listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood more about healing than he let on. When Sani mentioned her plan to bring her scattered relatives to Esperanza for gatherings, his eyes lit up with something that might have been hope. "How many relatives?" he asked. "Dozens," Sani replied. "Uncle Robert in Phoenix, Cousin Sarah in Colorado, Great-Uncle Thomas in Montana, some I've never even met. But Grandmother always said that family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up when you need them." David looked around the kitchen, taking in the warmth of the space Elena had created, the way afternoon light streamed through windows. She had carefully cleaned, the sense of home that persisted despite decades of isolation. "This place could hold a lot of families," he said quietly. "It could," Sani agreed, "if people were willing to help make it ready." For the first time since she had known him, David smiled. Not the guarded expression he usually wore, but a genuine smile that transformed his face and reminded her strongly of the little boy in Elena's photograph. "I might know some things about construction," he offered, "if you needed help." As the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, 4 generations sat around Elena's table making plans for breathing life back into a town that had been waiting far too long for people to remember its purpose. 3 months into their restoration work, Sani arrived at Esperanza to find Elena sitting on the porch with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. In her lap was an old wooden box, its contents scattered across a faded quilt, yellowed papers, photographs, and what looked like official documents. "Elena, what's wrong?" Sani asked, dismounting quickly and rushing to the older woman's side. "We have been living a lie," Elena said, her voice broken. "All these years, Miguel and I thought we were just caretakers, squatters on land that belonged to the state. But this morning, when I was looking for David's birth certificate to help with the veterans' benefits paperwork, I found these in my mother's old trunk." She held up a document with shaking hands. Even at Sani's age, she could see it was something official, heavy paper with elaborate borders, and a government seal that looked very old. "This is the original deed to Esperanza," Elena whispered. "It shows that my great-grandfather, Fernando Santos, legally purchased this entire town and all the surrounding land in 1885. He wasn't just a railroad worker. He was a businessman who saw an opportunity when the railroad company needed to sell quickly." Sani stared at the document, trying to understand what this meant. "But if your family owned the town, why were you hiding? Why didn't anyone know?" Eleanor's tears came faster now. "Because when the railroad moved and Esperanza began to die, men came, men with guns and legal papers of their own. They said Fernando's purchase was invalid, that he had no right to own land as a Mexican immigrant. They forced my family off the property and burned the records they could find." Miguel appeared from inside the house, his own face etched with decades of pain, finally coming to light. "My grandfather hid some of the papers," he continued the story. "He gave them to my grandmother before he died, made her promise to keep them safe. But by then, we were afraid. We thought if we tried to claim our rights, we would be killed or deported." "So you came back as caretakers," Sani said, beginning to understand. "We came back as ghosts," Miguel corrected, "living on our own land." Like criminals, hiding from anyone who might ask questions, maintaining buildings that should have been ours by right. Elena pulled out more documents, surveys, property descriptions, even receipts showing Fernando Santos had paid in full for 2,400 acres that included not just the town of Esperanza, but much of the surrounding desert. According to the papers, the Santos family were the rightful owners of land that had been illegally seized and later sold to the state. Your purchase, Elena said to Sani, it was not legal. The state had no right to sell land they did not own. But we never said anything because we were afraid, and because you brought hope back to this place. Sani felt her world spinning. Everything she thought she knew about Esperanza was wrong. The Santos family weren't refugees hiding in a ghost town. They were the legal owners, cheated out of their inheritance by racism and fear. What about the man who sold it to me? She asked. Pete Murphy. Did he know? Miguel's expression darkened. Pete Murphy's grandfather was one of the men who forced us off the land. The Murphy family has been selling and reselling our property for decades, making money from theft. The revelation hit Sani like a physical blow. Her wonderful dream of bringing her family together was built on someone else's stolen land. The $100 she had paid, money that was supposed to make everything legal and right, had actually been part of a fraud that went back 4 generations. I have to give it back, she said immediately. The land belongs to you. I'll go to Pete Murphy today and make him reverse the sale. But Elena reached out and took Sani's hands in her own. Child, it is not that simple. We have no lawyer, no money to fight the system. And you have brought life back to this place in ways we could never have imagined alone. Perhaps there is another way. Over the next hour, as they spread all the documents on Elena's kitchen table, a fuller picture emerged. The Santos family owned not just Esperanza, but a vast tract of land that was now worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Miguel's grandfather had been cheated out of a fortune, and his descendants had been living in poverty and fear when they should have been wealthy landowners. But the documents also revealed something else, a clause in Fernando Santos's original will stating that the land should be used for the benefit of all families seeking peace and a new beginning, regardless of their origin or circumstances. Your great-grandfather wanted this to be a refuge, Sani realized, a place where anyone could start over, just like you wanted, Elena said softly. Perhaps your grandmother's spirit guided you here not to buy land, but to help us reclaim what was stolen and use it the way it was meant to be used. David, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the kitchen. His military training had given him experience with legal documents, and he had been studying the papers with a tactical mind. We need to approach this strategically, he said. If we just walk into Pete Murphy's office with these documents, he'll find a way to make them disappear like his grandfather did. We need legal help, we need witnesses, and we need to document everything before we make any moves. But we don't have money for lawyers, Miguel protested. I might know someone, David said slowly. There's a legal aid clinic in Phoenix that helps veterans and their families with property disputes. Some of the lawyers there specialize in historical injustices. And Sani, your tribal government, has legal resources too. They deal with land rights issues all the time. For the first time since discovering the documents, Elena looked hopeful. You think we could really reclaim our land? I think we have to try, David replied. Not just for us, but for everyone who comes after us. If we don't fight this kind of theft, it keeps happening. Sani felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness that her simple plan had become so complicated, but also excitement about the possibility of real justice. What would happen to my dream, she asked, about bringing my family here for gatherings? Elena smiled through her tears. If we win, this place would belong to our families together, the Santos family and the Thunderhorse family. We could build something even better than what either of us imagined alone. As the afternoon wore on, they began to formulate a plan. David would contact the legal aid clinic and research the procedures for challenging fraudulent land sales. Elena and Miguel would gather every piece of evidence they had about their family's history in Esperanza, and Sani would talk to Aunt Maria about getting help from the tribal legal department. But they also made a pact. Whatever happened with the legal challenges, they would continue working together to restore Esperanza. Whether the Santos family reclaimed their land legally or Sani kept her deed, the town would be a place where families could gather and heal. As Sani prepared to ride home, her mind racing with everything she had learned, Elena pressed one more item into her hands, a small photograph of Fernando Santos standing in front of the Esperanza depot, his hand resting on a surveyor's marker that established the boundaries of his purchase. "Your grandmother brought you here for a reason," Elena said. "Maybe it wasn't to buy a ghost town. Maybe it was to help us become brave enough to reclaim what was always ours." That night, as Sani lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she realized that her adventure was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. What had started as a simple dream about family gatherings had become a quest for justice that could change multiple families' lives forever. She touched her grandmother's turquoise bracelet and whispered a prayer for wisdom and courage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she felt her grandmother's presence strongly, as if the old woman was smiling and saying, "Now you understand, little one. Real healing begins when we stop running from the truth." The legal battle for Esperanza took shape slowly, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. David's contacts at the Veterans Legal Aid Clinic had connected them with Maria Gonzalez, a young lawyer who specialized in historical land fraud cases. When she saw the Santos family documents, her eyes lit up with the excitement of someone who had found a legal treasure. "This is extraordinary," she said during their first meeting in Phoenix. "You have documentation that most families lost decades ago. Property surveys, payment receipts, even correspondence with railroad officials. This could be a landmark case." But she also warned them about the challenges ahead. Pete Murphy's family has been profiting from this fraud for generations. They won't give up without a fight. They'll claim the documents are forgeries, that too much time has passed for the claim to be valid, that you waited too long to come forward. Sani, sitting beside Elena in the lawyer's office, felt the weight of adult problems settling on her young shoulders. But Aunt Maria, who had driven them to Phoenix, squeezed her hand encouragingly. "My niece didn't start this fight," Aunt Maria said firmly, but her grandmother's spirit led her to the right place at the right time. The Thunder Horse family stands with the Santos family. Over the following weeks, their small group grew into something larger. Word of the case spread through both the Apache reservation and the Mexican-American community. Elena discovered that other families had similar stories: land stolen, documents destroyed, people forced to live as strangers on property that had once been theirs. David emerged as an unexpected leader in the legal preparation. His military experience with documentation and logistics proved invaluable as they organized evidence and built their case. More importantly, the work seemed to be healing something in him that the war had broken. He slept better, spoke more freely, and began to look toward a future instead of hiding from the past. "This gives me a mission again," he told Sani one afternoon as they sorted through old photographs in Elena's kitchen. "Something worth fighting for that doesn't involve hurting anyone." The breakthrough came when Maria Gonzalez discovered that Pete Murphy's grandfather had never properly filed some of the legal papers claiming ownership of Esperanza. In his rush to profit from the stolen land, he had made procedural errors that invalidated his claim under territorial law. "It's as if your great-grandfather's ghost was protecting the property," Maria told Elena with a grin. "The legal theft was so sloppy that it created vulnerabilities we can exploit." But their excitement was tempered when Pete Murphy learned about the legal challenge. Within days, he had hired a powerful Phoenix law firm and begun mounting his own offensive. He claimed that Elena and Miguel were illegal squatters who had forged documents to steal valuable land from legitimate owners. The local newspaper picked up the story, running headlines that made Sani's stomach clench. "Mexican family claims ownership of historic ghost town," and "Our land fraud claims too old to matter." Some of the coverage was sympathetic, but much of it played into fears about immigrants and property rights. "They're trying to make this about immigration instead of justice," David said angrily after reading one particularly biased article. "As if my grandparents' citizenship doesn't matter because they were born in Mexico." Elena, however, remained remarkably calm in the face of the media attention. "The truth has been hidden for 80 years, she said. "A few more months of struggle is a small price to pay for justice." The turning point came when Sani had an idea that nobody else had considered. She was reading her grandmother's journal one evening when she found an entry that mentioned meeting the old railroad man who kept the real records safe. "What if there are more documents?" she asked David the next day. "What if someone else has papers that prove your family's ownership?" David's eyes widened. The railroad company would have kept copies of all their land sales, but those records would be in corporate archives somewhere. Maria Gonzalez was intrigued by the possibility. Railroad companies had been required by law to maintain detailed records of all property transactions, and many of those archives still existed. If they could find the railroad's copies of Fernando Santos's purchase documents, it would be nearly impossible for Pete Murphy's lawyers to claim forgery. The search led them to a climate-controlled warehouse in Tucson, where the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company had stored decades of business records. David and Maria spent 3 days going through boxes of files, looking for any mention of Esperanza or Fernando Santos. They found it on the 3rd day, a complete file containing not just the sale documents, but correspondence between Fernando Santos and railroad officials, surveys of the property, and even a photograph of the signing ceremony. The railroad records confirmed every detail in Elena's family documents. But the file contained one more surprise, a letter from Fernando Santos to the railroad president, written shortly before his death. In it, he expressed his vision for Esperanza as a place where families of all backgrounds could find refuge and build new lives together, carrying forward the best traditions of their ancestors while embracing the possibilities of America. "Your great-grandfather wasn't just buying land," Maria explained to Elena when they returned with the documents. "He was creating a legacy, and that gives us an even stronger case because it shows his intent matches exactly what you've been doing with the property." As their court date approached, support for the Santos family continued to grow. The Apache Tribal Council passed a resolution supporting their land claim. Local churches organized prayer vigils. Even some of Pete Murphy's longtime clients began questioning whether they wanted to do business with someone who profited from stolen land. The night before the hearing, the extended Santos and Thunderhorse families gathered in Esperanza for a ceremony. Elena had insisted they hold it in the sacred cave, where Apache petroglyphs mixed with David's drawings to tell the story of connection across time and culture. Elena brought out her great-grandfather's ceremonial peace pipe, passed down through generations despite all their losses. Miguel sang an old Mexican song about homecoming. Aunt Maria shared Apache prayers for justice and healing, and David read aloud from Fernando Santos's letter about his vision for the land. But it was Sani who provided the moment that would stay with all of them forever. Standing in the flickering light of oil lamps, surrounded by ancient paintings and the people who had become her chosen family, she spoke words that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her 8 years. "My grandmother always said that some places choose their people and some people choose their places. But the best healing happens when people and places choose each other. Esperanza chose all of us, the Santos family to care for it, my family to dream about it, and all the families who will come here in the future to find what they need. She touched the turquoise bracelet on her wrist, feeling the weight of generations of wisdom. Tomorrow we go to court, not just to get land back, but to prove that justice isn't something that expires with time, that families belong together, and that some dreams are worth fighting for even when you're scared. As the ceremony ended and people began preparing for the night, Sani felt a deep peace settle over her. Win or lose, they had already accomplished something important. They had brought scattered families together, given a broken soldier a reason to heal, and proved that an 8-year-old girl with a big dream could change the world. The legal battle would be decided tomorrow, but the real victory, the healing, the connection, the restoration of hope had already begun. The Maricopa County Courthouse buzzed with tension as supporters filled every available seat. Elena Santos sat at the plaintiff's table, her weathered hands folded over the wooden box containing 4 generations of hidden documents. Beside her, David wore his military dress uniform, his bearing straight and proud for the first time since returning from war. Sani sat in the front row with Aunt Maria, her grandmother's turquoise bracelet catching the morning light streaming through tall windows. Behind them, dozens of people had come to witness what many were calling the most important land rights case in Arizona in decades. Pete Murphy's legal team filled the opposite side of the courtroom. 3 lawyers in expensive suits, surrounded by boxes of their own documents and legal precedents. Murphy himself sat rigid and defiant, his face flushed red with anger and embarrassment at having his family's fraud exposed. Judge Sara Castellanos, a woman whose own grandmother had immigrated from Mexico, called the court to order. Her voice was calm, but carried the authority of someone who understood the historical weight of the case before her. "We are here to determine the rightful ownership of the property known as Esperanza, Arizona," she began. "This case involves allegations of fraud dating back to 1923, documents that have been hidden for 80 years, and questions about whether justice has an expiration date." Maria Gonzalez rose to present the Santos family's case. She began with Fernando Santos's original purchase in 1885, walking the court through each document with methodical precision. The railroad records were particularly compelling, official correspondence that proved not only the legitimacy of the sale, but the railroad company's respect for Fernando as a successful businessman. Fernando Santos was not a squatter or an illegal immigrant, Maria stated firmly. He was an American citizen who legally purchased property, paid taxes on it, and built a community that served the railroad and the territory for nearly 40 years. She then detailed the 1923 fraud, how Pete Murphy's grandfather and his associates had used racial intimidation to force the Santos family off their land, destroyed legal documents, and filed false claims with territorial authorities. The defendants want you to believe that too much time has passed for justice to matter, Maria continued, but there is no statute of limitations on fraud, especially when the victims were prevented from seeking justice through fear and intimidation. Pete Murphy's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Harrison Wells, rose to present the defense. His strategy was exactly what Maria had predicted. Attack the authenticity of the documents, claim the Santos family had waited too long to assert their rights, and argue that current law superseded territorial-era purchases. Your Honor, we are dealing with documents that have allegedly been hidden for 80 years, Wells argued. How can we verify their authenticity? How do we know they haven't been altered or forged? My client's family has been paying taxes on this property and maintaining legal ownership for generations. But when Wells tried to present evidence of the Murphy family's tax payments and maintenance of the property, David rose from his seat with a folder of photographs. "Objection, Your Honor," Maria called out. "The defense is about to present false evidence." Judge Castellanos allowed David to approach the bench. With military precision, he laid out before and after photographs of Esperanza that he had been taking for years. These photographs prove that the Murphy family never maintained the property, David stated clearly. My grandparents and I have been the only caretakers for decades. Mr. Murphy collected money from the state for property he never visited and never improved. The photographs were devastating to Murphy's case. They showed broken buildings, collapsed roofs, and general decay that contradicted any claim of maintenance or investment. Wells grew visibly frustrated as his arguments crumbled. Your Honor, even if the Santos family once owned this property, they abandoned it. They made no attempt to assert their rights for 80 years. Elena Santos rose slowly from her chair, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. We never abandoned our land. We were driven from it by men with guns who threatened to kill us if we returned. We hid because we were afraid, but we never stopped believing it was ours. Her words hung in the air like a prayer. Judge Castellanos studied the elderly woman with obvious respect. Mrs. Santos, you and your family lived on the property as caretakers for decades after the alleged fraud. Can you explain why you didn't seek legal help during that time? Elena's voice was steady, but filled with decades of pain. Your Honor, in 1923, a Mexican family had no legal rights that would be respected by white courts. We were told we would be deported or killed if we made trouble. We stayed because it was our home, but we stayed in secret because we were afraid. Judge Castellanos nodded slowly. And when did circumstances change enough that you felt safe to assert your legal rights? When this little girl came to our town, Eleanor said, turning to look at Sani. When Sani Thunderhorse appeared with her grandmother's bracelet and her dream of bringing families together, I saw that times had changed. That courage could be shared between generations. The judge's expression softened as she looked at Sani, then back at the documents spread before her. I will note for the record that the railroad archives provide independent verification of the Santos family's claims. These are not documents that could have been forged or altered, as they were stored in a corporate facility with no connection to either party. Wells made one final attempt to salvage his case. Your Honor, even if we accept the historical claims, current Arizona law requires that property disputes be filed within specific time limits. The Santos family missed those deadlines by decades, but Maria was ready for this argument. Your Honor, Arizona law also recognizes the doctrine of adverse possession. The Santos family has lived on and maintained this property continuously for 80 years. Under state law, that gives them legal claim, regardless of the original fraud. She pulled out one more document, Miguel's father's railroad employment records, showing that the Santos family had maintained continuous residence and employment in the area even after being forced off their legal property. Furthermore, Maria continued, recent changes in federal law specifically address historical injustices against minority families. The Santos family's claim falls under provisions designed to remedy exactly this type of systematic discrimination. Judge Castellanos called for a brief recess to review the evidence. As lawyers huddled and spectators whispered, Elena reached across the aisle and touched Sani's hand. Whatever happens, Elena said softly, you brought our family into the light. That matters more than any legal decision. But when court resumed, Judge Castellanos had reached a decision that would change everything. Her voice was firm and clear as she addressed the packed courtroom. Having reviewed all evidence presented, this court finds that the Santos family's claim to the property known as Esperanza is valid and legally sound. The 1923 seizure of their land was fraudulent, and subsequent sales based on that fraud are therefore invalid. A cheer erupted from the Santos family supporters, quickly hushed as the judge continued. However, this court also recognizes that the current situation is complex, involving multiple parties who acted in good faith. Judge Castellanos looked directly at Sani. Miss Thunderhorse, your purchase was made without knowledge of the fraud. You are not responsible for historical injustices, and your investment in the property's restoration has been significant." Sani held her breath, wondering what the judge would decide about her own claim to Esperanza. Judge Castellanos continued her ruling, her words carefully measured as she navigated the complex intersection of historical justice and present-day reality. Therefore, this court orders the following. First, all property records will be corrected to reflect the Santos family as the rightful owners of Esperanza and the surrounding 2,400 acres. Second, the state of Arizona will refund Miss Thunderhorse's purchase price with interest, as they had no legal authority to sell property they did not own. Pete Murphy's face went ashen as the implications became clear. His family's decades of profit from stolen land would now face scrutiny, and criminal charges for fraud were a real possibility. Furthermore, the judge continued, Mr. Peter Murphy and his estate company will be required to return all profits made from the illegal sale and rental of Santos family property over the past 80 years, with interest calculated from the date of each transaction. Wells jumped to his feet. Your Honor, that could amount to millions of dollars. The financial penalty is excessive for transactions made by previous generations. Mr. Wells, Judge Castellanos interrupted sharply. Fraud does not become legal simply because it has been profitable for a long time. Your client's family built their wealth on stolen property. Justice delayed is not justice denied. She turned her attention back to Elena and Miguel. However, this court also recognizes that the Santos family has expressed a desire to honor their ancestors' original vision for this land. Mrs. Santos, you testified that Fernando Santos intended Esperanza to be a refuge for families in need. Is that still your intention? Elena rose again, her voice stronger now. Yes, Your Honor. My great-grandfather wanted this land to bring people together, not divide them. We want to honor that vision. In that case, Judge Castellanos said, this court approves the establishment of a community land trust with the Santos family as permanent trustees. This will ensure that Esperanza serves its intended purpose as a healing place for families while protecting it from future exploitation. She looked directly at Sani. Miss Thunderhorse, given your instrumental role in bringing this historical injustice to light and your own investment in the property's restoration, the Santos family has requested that you and your family be granted permanent use rights as founding members of the Esperanza Community Trust. Sani felt tears streaming down her face as the reality sank in. Not only had justice been served, but her original dream, bringing scattered families together, was not only preserved, but expanded beyond anything she had imagined. But the judge had one more surprise. This court has also received a petition from the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors and the Arizona Historical Society to designate Esperanza as a historic landmark, which will provide funding for restoration and maintenance of the buildings. And the sacred cave site. Miguel pulled out a pocket watch, his father's railroad watch that had been mentioned in his testimony as proof of the family's long connection to the land. He held it up so everyone could see, his voice choked with emotion. This watch belonged to my father, who worked on the railroad that brought prosperity to Esperanza. For 80 years, we kept it as a reminder that time passes, but truth endures. Today, time has finally caught up with justice. Pete Murphy's legal team was already gathering their papers in defeat, but Pete himself sat frozen in his chair, staring at the documents that had exposed his family's fraud. When he finally stood to leave, Elena Santos did something that surprised everyone in the courtroom. She walked across the aisle and stood before the man whose grandfather had destroyed her family's life. Mr. Murphy, she said quietly, I do not hate you for what your grandfather did, but I hope you will teach your children that some profits are too costly to keep. Pete Murphy looked at her for a long moment, his face a mixture of shame and defeat. I didn't know, he said finally. I thought it was all legal. Now you do know. Elna replied gently. What you do with that knowledge will determine what kind of man you are. As the courtroom slowly emptied, the extended Santos and Thunderhorse families gathered around Elena, Miguel, and David. Aunt Maria embraced Elena with tears in her eyes. Your great-grandfather would be proud, she said. You never gave up. On his dream, David, still in his military uniform, stood straighter than Sani had ever seen him. The legal victory had given him something he'd lost in the war, a sense that fighting for justice could actually succeed, that not all battles ended in loss and trauma. What happens now? Sani asked Elena as they prepared to leave the courthouse. Elena smiled, taking Sani's small hand in her weathered one. Now we go home to Esperanza and begin the real work. We have a town to rebuild, families to gather, and a vision to fulfill that has been waiting over a century to come true. Outside the courthouse, in the bright Arizona sunshine, Maria Gonzalez shook hands with each family member. This case will set precedent for other families dealing with historical land fraud, she told them. You've done something important, not just for yourselves, but for justice itself. As they drove back toward Esperanza, their Esperanza now, legally and permanently, Sani touched her grandmother's turquoise bracelet and whispered a prayer of gratitude. The little girl who had wanted to bring her family together had instead brought justice to light and healing to generations. 6 months after the court decision, Esperanza looked like a completely different place. The settlement money from Pete Murphy's estate had funded professional restoration work, while the historic landmark designation brought volunteer groups and preservation specialists from across the Southwest. Sani rode Kola down the main street on a crisp December morning, marveling at the transformation. The general store had been converted into a community center, its shelves now filled with books, crafts, and supplies for the families who came to stay in the restored houses. The old church had been rebuilt with a new roof and stained glass, windows that cast rainbow patterns across the original wooden pews. But the most dramatic change was the people. What had once been a ghost town was now home to a thriving community of families seeking healing and fresh starts. Uncle Robert had moved from Phoenix with his wife and teenage daughter, taking over the restored schoolhouse, where he taught children from several families who had joined the community. Cousin Sarah and her rancher husband had relocated from Colorado, bringing expertise in sustainable farming that was transforming the desert around Esperanza into productive gardens. Great-Uncle Thomas had surprised everyone by moving all the way from Montana, declaring that at 75, he was ready to spend his remaining years surrounded by family instead of isolated on a lonely ranch. His stories about railroad history perfectly complemented Miguel's memories, and together they had created a small museum in the old depot building. Elena Santos had become the unofficial mayor of Esperanza, coordinating the arrival of new families and ensuring that everyone who came seeking refuge found what they needed. Her arthritis was much better thanks to Sani's grandmother's medicine, and she moved through the town with energy that belied her 72 years. Miguel spent his days teaching woodworking and traditional crafts to anyone who wanted to learn, his workshop filled with the laughter of children and the quiet concentration of adults learning new skills. He had also taken over maintenance of the sacred cave, leading respectful tours for visitors who wanted to understand the spiritual significance of the land. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in David Santos, the broken veteran, who had once hidden in shadows, now served as Esperanza's coordinator for other veterans seeking healing. His military experience with logistics and organization made him invaluable in managing the practical aspects of the community, while his personal journey from trauma to healing gave him credibility with the damaged soldiers who came seeking peace. The house that had once held only David's childhood memories now hosted a support group for veterans dealing with PTSD and adjustment issues. His bedroom had been converted into an office where he helped former soldiers navigate the complex process of applying for benefits and finding mental health services. "It turns out," David told Sani one afternoon as they worked together in his woodshop, "that the best way to heal from war is to help other people heal from war." Who would have thought? Sani had grown too, though she was still only 9 years old. The legal battle and subsequent community building had taught her things about leadership and responsibility that most children never learn. But she had also learned to balance those adult lessons with the joy of simply being a child among people who loved her. She spent her school days in Uncle Robert's classroom with a dozen other children whose families had joined the Esperanza community. Afternoons were for helping Elena with community management, learning traditional crafts from Miguel, or riding Kola through the desert to check on the outlying areas of their vast property. The new town sign, crafted jointly by David and Miguel, with input from all the families, stood at the entrance to Esperanza. Esperanza, a place of hope and healing, founded 1882, restored 2025, all families welcome. Below it, in smaller letters, were quotes from both Fernando Santos and Ayana Thunderhorse about the importance of gathering scattered people into communities of love and support. On this particular December morning, Sani was riding out to meet the newest arrivals, a young Apache mother with 2 small children who had fled an abusive situation and needed time to heal and plan their next steps. The woman's story reminded Sani of her grandmother's teachings about the importance of safe places where people could remember who they really were without fear. As she crested the hill overlooking Esperanza, Sani paused to take in the full view of what her $100 investment had become. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played in the restored schoolyard, and adults moved purposefully between buildings that buzzed with productive activity. But what moved her most was seeing Elena and Miguel sitting in their old rocking chairs on the porch, watching their grandson David lead a group of veterans in what looked like a planning session for their next project. 3 generations of the Santos family, no longer hiding from the world, but actively engaged in healing it. Kola snorted softly and nudged Sani's shoulder, as if reminding her that they had work to do. The new family would be arriving soon, and there were preparations to make, stories to share, and healing to begin. As they rode down toward town, Sani touched her grandmother's turquoise bracelet, now joined by a small wooden horse that David had carved specially for her. The bracelet connected her to the past and the wisdom of her ancestors, while the horse represented the future and the new family they had all chosen to create together. That evening, as the sun set over Esperanza in shades of gold and rose that painted the adobe walls like a blessing, Sani sat on Elena's porch with her journal, her own version of her grandmother's record-keeping. She wrote, "Today I realized that grandmother was right about scattered families needing to come home. But home isn't just a place. It's the people who choose to love each other and heal together. Esperanza isn't just my town, or the Santos family's town. It's our town, belonging to everyone who believes that broken things can be made beautiful." Again, outside, the desert wind carried the sounds of laughter and conversation, of families gathering for dinner, and children calling to each other across yards that had once been empty and silent. Esperanza had finally become what Fernando Santos had dreamed it could be. A place where hope lived and healing happened, one family at a time.